In chapter 13, as we begin that chapter, it's the burden of Babylon as it begins, verse 1. It's thus dealing with the destruction of Babylon, and I have it titled that way in my outline for the first 16 verses, the destruction of Babylon. We'd gotten down to verse 11 and going through it last week, that God says, I will punish the world for their evil and the wicked for their iniquity, and I will cause the arrogancy of the proud to cease and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. We looked at that word world last week, that it can refer to the entire world in an unlimited sense. Sometimes this Bible uses it for a limited sense, dealing with that specific area of the world. Here, it would have a direct reference to Babylon. But it might also include all of the nations that Babylon symbolizes, which would be all of those that would be directly associated with it and would be supportive of Babylon. And thus it would include them as well. He says he's going to punish the world for their evil and the wicked for their iniquity. Wicked is very simply a category of people that have done wrong, that are still living in that sin, and intent on continuing in that sin. Someone turn over to the 9th Psalm and read verse 17 for us. Okay, the wicked, same word here, shall be turned into hell. That's the ultimate end of those who do wrong and continue to live in that wrong. Now then, in describing it in that way or that manner, it leaves it open for someone to change from that wickedness and do what is right. Man has that capability of, well, I use the phrase, controlling his own destiny. And I realize the usage of that by the world a lot of times, I'm not using it as they do. We control how we're going to end up. We control what we do. It is not destiny in that sense, but destiny as far as our eternal reward or punishment. We control where we spend eternity. In that sense, we realize that yes, we are saved by God's grace. God giving His Son to die upon the cross to save us from our sins, and we rely upon that grace, but we also realize that we must do, that I emphasize it, that we must do what God commands. We must live righteous lives in obedience to what God has commanded. And that would include in now becoming a Christian and in living the Christian life. And anyone who is not in that category of the righteous is in that category of the wicked. And their end is that, as Psalm 9:17 says, they will be turned into hell. So that's their end.
The latter part of that verse
Mm-hmm. That forget God. All the nations that forget God. That's really, if you look through history, what nation has not ended up forgetting God? None? That would probably be accurate. I don't know of any nation that ultimately has not forgotten God. You see God's long-suffering demonstrated with Israel as they forgot God time and time and time and time and time and time and time, and you can keep on going again, and God still allowed them time to repent. But they also were taken into captivity how many multitude of times. God trying to bring them to repentance. But yes, you're right in relationship to our nation. And to a certain extent, our nation has mirrored Israel in regards to the period of the Judges. We were a nation that was founded on, well, as it's called today, Judeo-Christian principles. The men who established and built our nation, they were believers in God, and they had a respect for the Bible. They built principles into our Constitution, Bill of Rights, that were based upon God's Word. That we are created with inalienable rights. That is, rights that are given by God. Built that way, became prosperous, successful as a nation. And then what starts happening? Just like Israel, when they came out of Egypt, they accepted that covenant. They went into the land of promise. They became rich. And what happened? They forgot God. Our nation today is a nation that has forgotten God. Bill?
Well, and it's amazing where God says that the land should rest once every 7 years, and you'll have plenty. And what they did is they rented out to other people so they could keep the money, and they didn't keep any of those 7-year periods through the 50 years or whatever.
No, they didn't. And they went into captivity 70 years as a result of that, so that the land would receive the rest that he had commanded them to give. But you're right. From the very beginning of time, they didn't observe those principles. They sound like today, they wanted the money instead. That was Israel. Look at today. And we see so many. The Bible is just as relevant today as it was back when it was written. The principles that you see in the Bible, you see the exact same things taking place today. But yes, the nations that forget God, and it is a warning, or should be a warning to our nation, but our nation won't listen. We are in a state today that just people will not listen to what God says. So it's a sad situation. We do what we can, and we influence those that we can influence for doing right. But as the nation as a whole, well, I just wonder how long God's going to allow it to stand. Dale?
Jeremiah was told by God several times, you preach to them, and he named off a bunch of details that Jeremiah saying, and they're not going to repent or listen to you. You preach to them anyway. You tell them this, that, and the other, and he names it all.
In the very first chapter of Jeremiah, you see that. With, I think it's around verse 4 through verse 10 or so, where God says, you go preach to them. They're not going to listen to you. They're going to hate you and persecute you. You preach to them anyway. Now then, I just pose a question. Was Jeremiah successful? Okay, he did what God said. So in that sense, he was successful. How many people listened to him and obeyed what he said? None? Basically, none? There was always a remnant, that's true. But basically none. It was a very small remnant. Maybe our standard of what is successful needs to be brought in harmony with what God's view of success is. We think so many times a successful church, for example, is one that has all of these activities and doing all of these things and has so many people that you can't even keep, they've got to go build huge buildings and multi-million-dollar complexes. And yet you look at what they teach and what they practice, and it's not anything like what the Bible teaches. A lot of preachers in the Lord's church have been fired, told to move on, because we're not growing. Whose fault is that? Well, obviously it's the preacher's fault. And so you get another one in, and the same thing happens after a couple of years. He's on his way because we're not growing. Now, if you're not growing spiritually, there's a problem there. Might not be the preacher's fault. Could be the preacher's fault. Might be the elder's fault. Might not be the elder's fault. Might be the member's fault. No, we don't want to talk about that part, though, do we? We need to continue to grow spiritually, no matter what the numbers are. But the success or failure of a congregation is not based upon numbers, but it is based upon obedience to God and His Word. In Jeremiah's day, basically God says, nobody's going to listen, and they're going to persecute you, but you keep doing it. And Jeremiah continued doing it, and he was successful. Then God mentions here in verse 11 that He will cause the arrogance of the proud to cease, lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. Basically, God's going to bring down their arrogance, their pride. In the Old Testament, we see this many times. In the New Testament, we see that God resists the proud. There's a statement in James 4 and 1 Peter 5. He gives grace to the humble. The apostles had that problem of pride and arrogance during Jesus' ministry. How many times do we see them arguing, which one's going to be the greatest? And one time Jesus brought a little child in. One who's going to be great has to be like him. Be like Christ, who did not come to be ministered unto, but to minister. But throughout the scriptures, you always see that God stands against the proud. And I think it's interesting when it says God resists the proud in the New Testament. The word resist is a military term that he's going to take his stand against, in a military way, someone who's proud. Now, why? Because of his pride. Nebuchadnezzar, in Daniel chapter, I think that's chapter 4. He goes out, he starts looking at, and look how great I am. Because he's looking at everything, and he was made to eat the grass as the oxen, and basically slept outside. And until he came to realize that God rules in the affairs of man. God brought him low in a very vivid way. God stands against the proud today as well. And of course, we all know what Solomon said, don't we? Pride, what? And a haughty spirit before a fall. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. So, Solomon, I wonder if Solomon in his life continued to realize that. It seems at times he forgot that aspect. In his older years in particular. Yeah. So God's going to bring down the haughtiness and the arrogancy.
What happened to Haman because of what he taught him to do?
Okay, that's another good illustration. Haman, and why did he want to hang Mordecai?
He wouldn't satisfy his narcissism, worship, bow down to him.
Okay, Mordecai refused to bow down to him. And so he had a hatred not only for Mordecai, but also for all of the Jews, so that he was going to destroy every one of them in the entire world. That's pride. He was hanged on his own gallows, brought down. Verse 12 then, he says, I will make a man more precious than fine gold, even a man than the golden wedge of Ophir. Here the destruction is going to be so complete, so total, that the existence of a man would be a very rare occurrence. It's not that they don't have any, but it's just so few that it's going to be, and he likens it the gold of Ophir. And if you look at and go through a study of that aspect, you will find numerous times in the Old Testament where gold is oftentimes associated with this city. We're not going to read all these, but just as an illustration, I have written down 1 Kings 9:28, 1 Kings 10:11, 1 Kings 22:48, 1 Chronicles 29:4, 2 Chronicles 8:18, 2 Chronicles 9 and verse 10, Job 22 and verse 24, and again in Job 28 and verse 16, and then Psalm 45 and verse 9. If you look at Job, when did the events of Job take place about?
Before Abraham, probably.
Okay, probably before Abraham. If you were trying to read the Bible chronologically, you would read Genesis 1 through 11, stop there, and read Job. And then after you get through Job, come back to Genesis and start with chapter 12.
Wasn't Job the oldest book in the Bible? What I had read so far.
Okay, is Job the oldest book in the Bible? That's a good question. It depends on one's view of who wrote Job. If Job is the author of the book that bears his name, then yes, it would be the oldest book. Moses would be, he wrote around 1500 BC. Job's dating would be around 2250 BC. So quite a bit of time before Moses. Other than Moses, Job would be the first. Now then, a lot of people do not accept that Job wrote the book, but that it was written at a later date by some unknown individual. So that's why I say it would depend on who wrote it. Yes, but let me clarify that. Yes, they argue those things about just about every book, but a lot of the times the arguments are based upon the view of prophecy, and it is a rejection that there is anything prophetic in the Bible. And so they have to take these books that would be written at a certain time by a certain individual and date them later because they've predicted things in their book that happens at a later date. That's not the case with Job. It's just a matter of who wrote it. So I personally believe Job probably was the author of his book. But whether he was or wasn't, it describes a time very early. That's the point that I was getting to. You have Job here in these passages referring to the gold Ophir or however it's pronounced. All the way through basically the Old Testament, you have that type of a terminology or that association of gold and along that line. Ophir, I'll pronounce it a lot of different ways for you, so you'll be totally confused as to where it is or what it is. It's possibly located, and we don't really know where, but Arabia is where some have located it. Dale, you want?
I'm just saying, Job did prophesy one thing. He said, "I know that my Redeemer liveth, and in the latter day he'll appear on the earth." So he has some of the forecast there.
Okay, but
Anticipation or whatever.
that's a lot of difference as to, for example, Isaiah here prophesying of Babylon's destruction and mentions Babylon by name and the event. There's a lot of difference between a reference to a redeemer and even in that reference in Job of "I know that my Redeemer lives." Some take that not as a reference or a prophecy of the Messiah. I believe that it is. But some say it is not so much that as someone who's going to redeem him from the situation that he's in at that time. So I say I believe that it has reference to the Messiah. Somebody else had their hand up. Bill?
Well, and if Job wrote it or not, we still know that it was an inspired writing.
Yes, it was an inspired writing, no matter who wrote it. So that would be true. And since you mentioned that, I'll mention a human author is not necessary to know who it is to know whether or not it's inspired. Book of Hebrews, who wrote it? Who is the human author then? If you're going to be a smart aleck about it, I mean, who is the human author of Hebrews?
Paul was the Hebrew of the Hebrews, so why wouldn't he have wrote it?
I can show you some brethren who will say, I don't know who wrote it, but I know it was not Paul. Yeah. I believe Paul was the human author. Doesn't matter, really. We know that the book was inspired. That's the point.
How old was this person that said they knew it wasn't him?
Professors at universities and colleges associated with our brethren.
Still not old enough to be there when it happened.
So, for example, Paul talks about, and here's the reason they would say that. Paul says, and I've forgotten exactly where it is, but that he basically signs every letter. Where's that signature in Hebrews? That basically he signs every letter. Where's the signature in that type of a statement? I was saying it is 1 Thessalonians, the last part of the book. So, where's the statement in Hebrews? No, I'm just saying that's why they would say, I know it was not Paul, because that is not in there. I still believe it was Paul. And there's answers to that, just like there's answers to other things, and they will argue until they get to eternity as to who wrote it. It's still inspired, and that's the whole point. Knowing who the human author is not necessary for knowing whether or not it's inspired. Now then, getting back to verse 12, and the rarity of men is very simply because God knew the conduct of the Babylonians, and he was going to destroy them because of it. All the men basically are going to be put to death. So there might be a few left, but they're going to be very, very rare. And that goes back to the previous verse even, that he's going to punish them for their evil and the wicked for their iniquity. Well, that's describing Babylon, Babylonian men. And so now then, he's going to make the men so rare you almost don't find them in verse 12.
I don't know if you noticed or not when you was in Russia, but
They're rare because they were killed in battle in Russia. And when you were saying that, I was thinking about the church there in Murmansk. It was it was mostly women. And the men, they just weren't around. And sometimes the ones who were continued to fall back into drunkenness, which was a great problem there. Of course, we wouldn't have that problem in our nation, would we? And I would say the problem resides there for exactly the same reason it resides here. They have utter despair because there is nothing that they have other than this life. And when you take away any hope of anything after this life, and you start looking at the world around you, you become despondent, and that leads to drinking, and the drinking leads to more despondency, and it becomes a revolving circle. One leads to the other. Yeah. The happiness was found at the bottle of vodka.
She was surprised that we were always joking. Said, how do y'all find so much joy? Of course, we went on to explain to her about Christ and all that.
Right. But yeah, that's where their joy resides. How many people get off work in our nation and the first thing they go to is happy hour to get their fix? Because why?
Waiting in a convenience store to buy 45 lottery tickets to make people wait.
Well, that's another subject, but since you mentioned the lottery, I'll just say this about it. Not even from a biblical standpoint, how many times do you think Bill Gates stands in line waiting to buy lottery tickets? That should be enough said right there to say something to you.
I know one man, you read about that one man that bought the first lottery. He won the first $1 million in Florida. He found it.
Yeah.
And he was supposedly a Christian.
A member of the church, supposedly.
He was very opposed to the lottery publicly.
But he is the one who won the first $1 million lottery in Florida because he found the ticket. Verse 13. Therefore will I shake the heavens, and the earth shall remove out of her place, in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. The shaking of the heavens and earth is signifying the presence of God in Babylon's response. Babylon's response at God's presence, causing them to shake in fear. It is a type of figure that is found many times in the scriptures where inanimate objects are pictured as having an emotional response to something. Generally, the presence of God. I've got several passages. Let's just read one, the 97th Psalm in verses 4 and verse 5. That his lightnings enlightened the world, and the earth saw and trembled. The hills melted like wax at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the Lord of the whole earth. So here's human actions or emotional responses in relationship to the presence of God. Here, obviously, because of God's wrath and bringing the Medo-Persian Empire to destroy Babylon. Because of Babylon's iniquity. In verse 14, and it shall be as the chased roe and as a sheep that no man taketh up, they shall every man turn to his own people and flee every one to his own land. So here Babylon is going to respond like a chased roe, a gazelle fleeing, or a sheep as they would flee. So they're going to respond with with fear, timidity, helplessness. That's one of the things I think in particular about sheep. I don't know the nature too much of gazelles, but sheep, they'll flee, but if they're cornered, they give up. They don't really fight back. Helplessness. They don't really have much to fight with. So they just quit and give up. Babylon's going to be like that at the presence of God. Scared, timid, no courage, helpless. They can't do anything. Can't fight back. God's going to bring a destruction.
We got a song. We don't have started this one. It was about the sheep. Don't scatter the sheep.
Don't scatter the sheep. I remember the song. Don't Scatter the Sheep was the name of it, though. Yes. The latter part of this verse, they shall every man turn to his own people and flee every one to his own land, is dealing with those who had migrated to Babylon. Well, if a destruction's coming upon Babylon, what do they want to do? Get back home, someone said. They're going to try and flee back to their own nation and their own people. I could solve that problem real quick, but you probably don't want to hear my solutions and preventing them from entering and in getting rid of them. But there is a little bit of a parallel, though. Here's a destruction coming upon Babylon. What do those who have entered Babylon, whether it be legal here, though, immigrants to Babylon, what do? They leave.
That's one thing that happened to the Roman Empire. Their army was composed like that.
their army was composed of nations that they had overtaken. That's true. You had the Roman guard, the Praetorian Guard, that would have been Romans, that was protecting Caesar and Rome. But a lot of on the outlying areas, the soldiers would have been from other nations. They did not have a real allegiance to Rome, and so when things started breaking up and you had other nations coming in and attacking them, they didn't really stand and fight like a Roman would. They sometimes even turned upon their own people, or they turned upon the Romans, I put it that way. But that really was not Rome's problem. Rome, has anybody ever looked at and read Edward Gibbon's The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire? Sometime just skim through it, if nothing else, and look at what he sets forth as the causes of the downfall of Rome. Because he could be talking about America. He has, I think, if I remember correctly, 6 reasons that he gave as far as the downfall of Rome. 6 points. And every single one of them applies to America. So, we'll stop there and begin, I guess, Lord willing, next week in verse 15.